Please help me welcome Pastor Katerina from Pasadena Mennonite Church.
Thank you so much, Maida. It is really good to be here with you all for such a time as this. Maida asked me to share this Pastor's Pulse during Native American Heritage Month and also before the Thanksgiving holiday. I draw from a text from Romans 12:15 that says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn." I know that a week after the elections, there are some Christians who are rejoicing and there are some Christians who are mourning.
That's right.
And we are here today to acknowledge that and feel some of the complexity of that. I've been reading this book by Bishop Stephen Charleston. He's a Choctaw elder and also an Episcopal bishop. And he writes in this book, which is titled, "We Survived the End of the World, Lessons from Native America on Apocalypse and Hope." He talks about how his people have survived multiple apocalypses. He says apocalypse isn't a new thing, and it's not even a future thing. It's happened before. And it's happened to our people. And he talks about the trail of tears that his ancestors were on that represented the end of their world at that time. And some of us might feel like we're living in the midst of apocalypse in these days, that maybe these are the last days, and yet we can look to these stories of survival and hope from our scriptures, from our traditions, and from those around the world who've lived it and maybe who are still living it. Over the last decade, I've had the opportunity to be immersed in communities of survival and hope, but also communities who know deep grief as I've walked with Indigenous sisters and brothers who are seeking restorative justice and land rights. And for me, one of the most transformative experiences that God has opened up for me has been through my alma mater, Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, which is located on land where Potawatomi peoples once lived and thrived in northern Indiana. And starting about 10 years ago, God opened up a path for me to co-organize pilgrimages with Potawatomi elders today, whose people were forcibly removed from that land where I studied in seminary to Kansas and then to Oklahoma. Potawatomi elders share their stories along the way of this journey, and we remember the forced removal of their ancestors on what was called the Trail of Death. Most of us have heard of the Trail of Tears, which I mentioned earlier, in which U.S. militias of white settlers force marched over 16,000 people, Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, and even enslaved Africans, on a death march to Indian Territory. But most of us probably haven't heard of the smaller forced removals. I didn't. I thought there was just one big one. But there were hundreds of small forced removals that happened in the 1800s. And this one that I have had the chance to remember now for the last decade with Potawatomi people involved about 850 of their ancestors in northern Indiana after their chief Menominee, refused to sign a treaty with the U.S. government to give up their lands. The U.S. government didn't listen to that, didn't listen to his refusal to sign, and said, we're gonna push you out anyway. A president at that time actually had promised the largest deportations in U.S. history. Sound familiar? It was Andrew Jackson who pushed forward the Indian Removal Act in Congress and said, this is gonna make us feel secure, this is gonna make our economy better, and we're gonna gain a whole lot of land in the process. And so it ended up pushing through this legislation that resulted in the removal of tens of thousands of people from their homelands. So this last summer, I had the chance to journey on this pilgrimage again for the 5th time. I co-led a group from our seminary for 10 days, and we walked part of the route. We camped along the way. We stopped to pray at stone markers that remember unmarked graves of children and elders who died. It was a drought year when they were forcibly removed, so water was so scarce along the way for 3 months of marching. The elders who joined us guided us in prayer and storytelling. We sat around the fire at night listening to their memories and to their stories of what had been passed down from their ancestors. And we got just a very small taste of what it might have been like, and we sought to really mourn with those who mourn, to enter into their story as best we could. And after 10 days of this, and being in this tight-knit community in sweaty vans, traveling in the heat, we were exhausted when we got to Oklahoma. But there we were hosted by the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and these are survivors, descendants of those who had survived these forced marches, like the Trail of Death. We stayed with them for 2 days, being hosted on their lands, and they just pulled out all the stops. It was amazing, and hosted us for meals. We went to their cultural center, we learned about their language, their traditions, and how they've managed to rebuild after so much destruction, after so much death. And on the very last night there, we were hosted in this feast that the Potawatomi Youth Leadership Program put on. These are interns for their tribe, learning language, learning dance, learning some of the traditions again. And they were learning some of the food practices. So they hosted us with a meal with beans and corn and squash, bison chili, strawberries, just this amazing feast laden for our pilgrims on this pilgrimage. And we shared stories and listened to their dreams for the future, listened to just a sense of life at the end of the Trail of Death, that it didn't end. It didn't end the people's journey with lament, but now continues with rejoicing. And I really felt like by entering into lament, by doing some really crucial truth-telling together as a group of mostly white folks like me, not exclusively, but we were invited in this act of grace, and that lament somehow opened that up for us to have a feast together with survivors of genocide. So I wonder if maybe that was why we were invited, because we were willing to face that history and that pain together. Shared lament can open up possibilities, I believe, for reconciliation. So you might recognize maybe some themes in this image that I've put before you. Pilgrims eating together around a table with Native Americans, sharing food. It may sound familiar, so it brings to mind the Thanksgiving story, right? Or at least the Thanksgiving myth of this story of the pilgrims in the 1600s in New England gathering around the table to feast together. I'm curious, because I want to unpack that story for a few minutes here. How many of us may have grown up doing Thanksgiving pageants in schools? Anybody here? Some of you? I know I did in elementary school, where we made pilgrim hats, or unfortunately Indian headdresses maybe, or imagined what it might have looked like. I remembered a myth of the first Thanksgiving. It's a compelling story, but when we look at history, it's unclear where that story actually came from, because there's a couple different origin points for that first Thanksgiving, but the holiday itself wasn't actually created until 1863 under President Lincoln for a variety of reasons after the Civil War, wanting to unite divided sides. In 1621, there were Puritans near Plymouth who survived a tough year only because indigenous peoples, the Wampanoag, had helped them to survive and live on the land. They joined them and they brought food to the feast, which was mostly between men, and it wasn't called Thanksgiving. It was a rare moment of friendship. Unfortunately, at the time, that didn't continue onward, because a few years later, the Pilgrims did proclaim a Thanksgiving feast, and this time it happened after a horrible massacre against the Pequot peoples by English Christians, who shot, clubbed, and burned alive over 700 people, Native Americans, including women and children. And then Plymouth held a day of Thanksgiving, giving thanks to God for their victory over Native Americans. That story turns my stomach, that to them was a Thanksgiving feast, that they actually prayed in thanks to God. And sadly, that's the kind of Thanksgiving as a military victory that became the norm for white Christians and settlers at the time. And it wasn't that first coming together of people sharing the land and experiencing dependence on one another. For the most part, though there were some friendships, European Christians didn't see Native Americans as fully human. And it's become a story of largely cultural genocide and theft of land. Thanksgiving as a holiday wasn't designed to honor Native peoples. And it's telling that the Wampanoag, the indigenous group who first discovered the desperate pilgrims on their shore, are still here today. And that they don't actually celebrate Thanksgiving, from what I can tell, for the most part. They actually observe a national day of mourning in remembrance of the ongoing oppression and erasure of Native cultures around the world. They do gather to give thanks at other times of the year. Gratitude feasts are core to a lot of indigenous traditions, but on the fourth Thursday of November, they observe a day of mourning. So I'm gonna just pause here, because I want to be honest with you all. I actually love Thanksgiving. I love the pumpkin pie. I love the turkey and the fixings. I love that cranberry blob sauce that comes out of those cans, that purple deliciousness. And in my family, I love how we go around the table and we do share gratitudes for the year. So there's this, it's messy for me and complex. Knowing more, though, about the history of Thanksgiving makes me wonder, what do we give thanks for? For food and for family, yes. But are we also giving thanks for the land that belonged to others who were forcibly removed from their homes? Are we grateful that we're #blessed, but that sometimes comes at the expense of others? Because it's so tricky in this country and really messy for us as Christians or as white folks. What are we giving thanks for? Is it for a false history, perhaps? The Apostle Paul instructs us to mourn with those who mourn. And Jesus tells us in the Beatitudes, blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who mourn. So I wonder how mourning could shape our gratitude or even deepen it in some form or other, and maybe how telling the truth can open up pathways for real reconciliation to happen between indigenous communities and those of us who are immigrants or settlers on their land, or even whose ancestors were forcibly moved here. We're living in this time when alternative facts are shaping reality, when histories of racism in this country are being questioned as unpatriotic, when the truth is being manipulated or avoided. As a friend has often said, denial ain't just a river in Egypt. How might lament help us to become people of truth, Christians who stand by the truth in this season? So I want to offer a few ideas as I close about maybe some possibilities for this Thanksgiving to consider, even if we choose to gather in gratitude, how to bring in some stories from the underside, stories from those who are mourning in this time. So some might choose to join Indigenous people in a national day of mourning. Others may choose to include other ways of remembrance at their Thanksgiving tables or in their churches. Perhaps we could learn more about Tongva peoples in this place. I appreciated Pastor Myra's land acknowledgement statement. And those are just ways to acknowledge that we are on lands that have a connection since time immemorial with Indigenous peoples. Maybe we could even, I picked up a word book of Tongva language. Maybe we could learn a few words. We could find some online to share around the table and to ask questions of, where are the peoples now? What happened to them? What are their priorities? We could light a candle of remembrance and offer a prayer for the descendants of those who have survived genocide. I know our church has been on a journey of learning, of decolonization, of kind of peeling back the layers of history in this place and joining in Indigenous peoples' struggles. And we've decided to include a line item in our budget for restitution for Indigenous peoples and also for Black folks who have also survived so much harm and violence. And that line item of restitution or reparation goes to the Tongva Land Conservancy, which you can look up online at tongva.land. And they accept a settler or a guest exchange tax. So this is a way for people on this land to acknowledge that they're guests on Indigenous lands. And then finally, one other way that we could join in advocacy in this season is through Indigenous people's work for a Truth and Healing Commission. This would be the first of its kind. You've probably heard in South Africa there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In Canada, they had one around boarding schools as well. Right now, Indigenous folks have been working for years, and they have a window of time to get Congress to support the Truth and Healing Commission before the next administration comes in on the Indian Boarding School Policies Act, to really say, to really expose and to have a chance for survivors of the boarding schools that removed Indigenous children from their family and homes and sent them to schools that were often abusive. It's a chance for their healing and for restoration. So there could be a vote before the end of the year. So I encourage you all to look that up. As Indigenous educator Nikki Sanchez has said, this history is not your fault. You weren't there at the time, but it is our responsibility. We have an opportunity now to work for justice, to work for reconciliation and truth-telling. And I think Thanksgiving is a great time for that this month as we gather around the table with our families and communities. We believe in a God who remembers, a God who grieves with us in Jesus, a God who one day will gather us together for a feast of all peoples, all nations, a feast of reconciliation. And until then, we've got a lot of work to do, church. Thank you.